Welcome to the AmericanaMusic.com podcast with your host, Sarah Popejoy.
Today on AmericanaMusic.com, we close out our season with Geoffrey Himes, the author of the book Willie Nelson All of the Albums, The Story Behind the Music, which releases this coming Tuesday. Between 1977 and 2020, he wrote weekly music publications in the Washington Post. Also, he's written for Rolling Stone, Paste, the New York Times, DownBeat, the Smithsonian, and Texas Music Magazine, among other publications. We are excited to have Geoffrey Himes on our show today. Welcome, Geoffrey.
Glad to be here.
Geoffrey, you intentionally set out to write about the music of Willie Nelson in this book. What inspired you to write this book, and what's the story behind how this journey began for you?
Yeah, Willie's written a lot of autobiographies. Joe Nick-Patowski wrote an excellent, sort of straightforward biography of him. And I wanted to do something that was different from all those. What I'm always been interested in is what makes us interested in musical figures. It's not their escapades. It's not their, offstage habits or whatever. It's their music. And often coverage of musicians sort of misses that obvious point. So I wanted to try to tell Willie's life story through the music he recorded. And that's what I did. The book has a lot of pictures. There's a little box for each of the 152 albums that I discuss. But it's not a coffee table book. It's not a discography book. It's a 150,000 word narrative where I talk about his life through his music and how it developed from his childhood in Abbott all the way till today.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book. I usually like to highlight in books, and I couldn't bring myself to do that with yours. So Willie was a songwriter who wrote Crazy for Patsy Cline and Hello Walls for Farron Young, which I did not realize he wrote Hello Walls. Two giant country hits that still resonate today, and he's written a whole lot of other songs as well for other artists. I feel, though, that at the heart of this book, especially in the beginning, is his struggle toward becoming a recording artist and finding a successful recording artist, I should say. He was a recording artist, but finding the producer and the sound to match his vocal quality, especially when they were trying to add strings and backing chorus vocals. Can you talk a little bit about his struggles that you so eloquently detailed in this book?
Where this all starts. Created a book of songs when he was 11. It was like a songbook, just the lyrics. And he hand wrote all like 20 copies of it or whatever it was and hand gave it out, sold it to his friends. But even those songs, they're well constructed. They're talking about adult themes. Obviously, he got a lot better. That talent is where it all begins. But he also was a brilliant singer and a brilliant guitarist. And he wanted to exercise those sides of his skill set as well. At a point when he had those two hits you just mentioned, plus Nightlife recorded by Ray Price, and Funny How Time Slips Away. He'd already built a really solid reputation. He could have been a successful behind-the-scenes songwriter like Boudleaux Bryant or Harlan Howard.
Yeah.
But he knew in his heart that he wanted to perform. Seems a little strange considering his lifestyle for so many years. Part of him wanted to be a Baptist preacher. He wanted to have a congregation that he could explain life to. For obvious reasons, that wasn't going to fit in with the other side of his life. Being a live performer of his own songs or songs he chose and arranged, he could do that in a sense. He could preach about, okay, your heart is broken. Somebody left you for somebody else, or you lost your job, or your mama died, or whatever. And how do we deal with this? These are the fundamental crises in all of our lives. And he sort of demonstrated how you could acknowledge that it really hurts a lot, but you can still retain your dignity. You can still move forward. And song after song after song that he wrote and or recorded follow that template. And it took him a while to find his congregation, but boy, he found it.
Oh, yeah. I found that little fact interesting, too, only because I read about Bob Wills, and he wanted to be a preacher at one point, too.
There's a lot of commonality between preachers and performers on stage. It's what they say and how they say it that is important. Willie exemplifies that as best as anybody.
Yeah. I remember you said something about how a lot of poets and writers, depending on where they lived and their economic stature, depended on whether or not they even could write. write, whether they had the time to write, but that because he was born in Texas during his time period, pour around a lot of music, that he ended up becoming a songwriter. And I found that such a neat observation.
I think that literary talent is not concentrated in the upper class. It's just that the upper class has a better chance at having the time and education and connections to get it published as novels or poetry or whatever. You could be Lightning Hopkins, sort of a gambler in Houston, or Cindy Walker in Texas, or Willie Nelson in Abbott. If you have this talent and this drive to express yourself in words, it's going to come out in some way. And for these people, the obvious way is through popular music.
Right.
I think the whole thing that happened with Bob Dylan winning the Nobel Prize for Literature, which freaked a lot of people out, makes perfect sense to me, is that songs are a literary art. And they're a literary art that depends on sort of a performance to come alive. But the same thing is true of plays, like William Shakespeare or Eugene O'Neill or Henrik Ibsen. They're also writing words for performance. If they deserve Nobel Prizes, certainly does Bob Dylan, and so does Willie Nelson.
Yeah, for sure. I don't think I realized there was that kind of response that people were freaked out about it. I think because it seems so natural to me.
Outlaw country, which is obviously a theme in the Willie book, it comes out of this desire we've been talking about to perform the way seems true to yourself. And Willie and Waylon Jennings and Merle Haggard out in California, they all face this problem of they have something to say. They have sort of an unorthodox way of saying it that doesn't fit necessarily the conventions of Nashville at the time, but they sort of stuck to their guns and eventually found an audience so large that Nashville couldn't deny them anymore.
Oh, yeah. On Willie's Both Sides Now album, that was named after the Joni Mitchell song, I wanted to read an excerpt from your book. He wasn't interested in electric guitars that roared with hormones. He was interested in steel guitars that moaned with hard lessons learned. He wasn't interested in the issues of dating, giddy infatuation, and weepy breakups. He was interested in the issues of marriage, of can't live with her and can't live without her. After all, he had been married himself since he was 18. I thought that was a really interesting view into who Willie Nelson was.
Today, country music seems to be more interested in addressing 20-somethings who are dating.
Yeah.
But historically, up until Garth Brooks came along, country music was really a marriage music, a music that was trying to wrestle with the questions of how do you keep a marriage together, how do you stay sober, how do you find a way to keep your family alive. These are difficult problems to solve and don't have easy answers. The best songwriters wrestled with them. But Willie was always seemed like an old guy, even when he was a teenager playing polka bands in Texas. He was always playing with people older than him. He was always writing these songs about marriage when he was just still a kid. And he was an old soul, even as a teenager.
Yeah, it's funny because that's the view I've always had of him, too.
And now he really is old.
Yeah, he's in his 90s.
Older than all of us.
Would you mind telling the trigger story about how he ended up buying the vintage Martin guitar with nylon strings?
Let me say this. When he got Trigger, which was his guitar with the nylon strings, it sort of changed the way he sounded. The nylon strings are more responsive to touch. They're just not as loud or as piercing as steel strings or as an electric guitar. It just fit with the kind of music he was creating, which was that sort of understated, nuanced kind of approach to these breakups and recoveries. When he was first getting started, he was playing electric guitar, Texas dance halls. You look at the cover of the Panther Hall concert in Fort Worth album. He's playing, it's an electric guitar. That's who he was at that point. But even then, his vocal phrasing was so weird that people had trouble playing with him in the studio. This created a lot of his problems in the early records he made for Liberty and RCA. With his live bands, once they played with him long enough and had to follow his directions, they got it. They knew how to respond to the way he would delay words or rush words. But the session players who are meeting them, hearing these songs for the first time before they record them, didn't have that luxury. So that was a constant problem in his recording career, is trying to get people to figure that out. I mean, Fred Foster, who produced him during his brief stay on Monument Records, finally said, just don't listen to what he's doing. He's telling the musicians, just play straight and he'll always come in at the right time. Just don't get distracted by his delays and stuff. That worked.
Yeah. One thing that I really like about your book is how you talked about the music and a little bit of the stories behind the music, but you also gave kind of a background of what was going on in his life. You talked about the song, What Can You Do to Me Now? How the next day his house caught fire in Ridgetop, Tennessee. It eventually led to him moving back to Texas.
When I say that I'm focusing on the music, that doesn't mean I'm ignoring the life that's going along at the same time. It's a different emphasis than a lot of books.
Right.
For me, the music's in the foreground
Yes.
and the life is in the background, where in most books it's the reverse. The subtitle of the book is The Stories Behind the Music, and that's definitely part of the book. What Can You Do to Me Now? There was a lot of things going wrong in his life at that time. His things with RCA were falling apart. His new wife had wrecked their car, even before his house burned down. And so the circumstances sort of sparked the song. But the song works whether you know the story or not, because everybody has been in a point in their life where it's been just one thing after another. People you love or people who you work for or strangers are just giving you a hard time, or things are just going wrong. And you say, oh my God, what can they do to me now? And he captures that moment. And one of the things that I believe as a music writer is that what's important about music is not so much what it tells us about the artist. It's about what it tells us about ourselves. How do we react in situations like that? I mean, how perhaps should we react in situations like that? And that's why these songs are so viable, because again and again, Willie's giving some examples of how, we get into these situations and how we might get out of them.
Wow. When I was living in Nashville, I did live in Nashville for 10 years. And when I was living there, the story of Willie Nelson going to Texas, and that's when things took off, was there. But I had not heard about his house burning down and that kind of being the real thing that preceded their decision to finally move.
The ironic thing is the house burned down. They moved down to Texas. They are renting a place on somebody's ranch. They remember how much they like Texas. But in the meantime, they're rebuilding the house in Ridgetop with insurance money, and it gets rebuilt. They move back to Ridgetop. And then they realizes, so I come to Nashville like once every few months to record, and then I'm always going back every weekend to Texas to play because that's where I make the most money. Wouldn't it make more sense if I lived in Texas and drove to Nashville once every 3 months instead of driving to Texas every weekend?
Right.
Plus, his family was there. He's very close to his sister. The sources of his music, the Tex-Mex, the polkas, the blues, they were all sort of Texas raw materials for his music making.
I also thought that story was hilarious about him running into the house. Everybody was safe, but he had to go get Trigger and another guitar case that was full of...
The joke in Nashville for a while was, if you want to get high, just stand downwind from when Willie's house burns down.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome. You talked about Yesterday's Wine, which preceded this Phases and Stages, which was when he really started writing concept albums. Can you explain for those who aren't aware of what a concept album is?
Right. Usually most albums, there's 10, 12 songs, and each song is like a little mini story in itself, a little world by itself. The concept album is where the songs are all sort of about the same characters, same kind of situation. One song informs the next song.
Yeah.
Tommy, the Who's album. If you're a writer, like Willie was, he was many things, but one of the things he really was a writer. You want to try something more ambitious than just write individual songs. It's about this guy dies and goes to heaven. He meets God and they have a discussion about, and then he gets sent back to earth to try to preach to the people and straighten out his own life. The first side is sort of these philosophical songs about what's important in life, and the second side is about how to make your relationships work. It tells a story in a general sense, not in the way that Oklahoma or Guys and Dolls tells a story. You get more out of each song if you've heard the songs around it. I think that's what makes the difference. Phases and Stages, which is about a divorce. Side one is often the man's side. Side two is often the woman's side. That's my favorite one. Redheaded Stranger, about the title character wandering around Montana and Colorado, trying to find himself and punish his enemies and find the woman of his dreams. There's Tougher Than Leather, which is one he wrote just after his lungs collapsed and he was in the hospital, which is about a Texas gunfighter who's old and facing young challengers and lost his true love and trying to approach the end of his life gracefully. That's the really underrated album. He once told me that it was one of his favorite records. A couple others that could argue they're in the same spirit. They don't tell a story in the way we think of a movie or a novel telling a story. The songs are connected in a way that help the songs. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
I wanted to ask you about the Highwaymen, Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings, Johnny Cash, and Chris Christopherson. They released I believe, 3 albums. You were not a fan much of the first 2.
No.
Can you tell us a little bit of why? I personally love the first single. Of course, it could have also been my age when it came out. You know what I mean? How you grow an affinity for things that came out when you were younger. But just if you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, an important part of Willie's career is he's always enjoyed collaborating with other people. Once he had the commercial clout that he got from Red-Headed Stranger and Willie and Waylon records, he used it to do these duet albums with these older country singers that he really admired, like Farron Young or Ray Price, Roger Miller, and also to tribute albums to some of his favorite songwriters like Chris Christopherson and Cindy Walker. And some of those are fabulous records. If they connect in the studio and the day that they're recording them, they'd be great. The early Waylon stuff is really wonderful. The later stuff, not so much. He had done a tribute album to Chris Christopherson. He and Chris did a movie together called Songwriter. It's actually a much underrated movie. Very funny. It's the best movie that I think that Willie made. It yielded a really great soundtrack album. So he had a strong connection with us. Chris was writing outside the box songs and for country music at the same time that Willie was trying to break in. Willie and Waylon were very close because they were both sort of renegades in Nashville, sort of insisting that they wanted to do things their way. Give us a chance and we'll make some hits. And then they delivered on their promise. Obviously, the central duo in the outlaw music movement. Willie and Johnny had not had a lot of contact. They admired each other from afar, but they didn't really know. And they sort of ran into each other. I think it was an awards show. They sort of hit it off. Said, well, let's do something. Let's invite Waylon and Chris too. So they made this record, and it was obviously not well rehearsed, sort of thrown together. They're charismatic figures. You could go a long way on that. But it was never a sense that they were a real group, 4 different acts in the studio at the same time. And the second album was even more so that way. But on the third record, they really sort of knuckled down, wrote some better songs, rehearsed them, and it was a great record. You know, their live shows were pretty good too. And Willie and Johnny did a VH1 live sort of unplugged concert, which was a lot of fun too.
One of your comments was the amount of echo on the albums, which is kind of very mid-'80s thing to do. Willie owed $16 million to the IRS when they seized his property and his recordings. He didn't want to declare bankruptcy, and he talked the IRS into releasing his recordings to pay the bill. The result was an album called The IRS Tapes. Can you talk a bit about the pinch he was in the resulting album?
Actually, I interviewed him in the middle of this crisis. Remember, I said, is it a real challenge to deal with owing $16 million to the government? Willie said, oh, it's just a bump in the road. I said, Willie, that's a pretty big bump. He said, not if you say it real fast. So he had that attitude that problems come, they get resolved, life goes on. And that was his philosophy in life, his philosophy in songwriting. That characteristic goes a long way in explaining what his appeal to people is. The government had seized all this stuff in Willie's studio, including those tapes. They worked out this deal where they would release the tapes and keep the money. They think, oh, well, good, we'll have another Red-Headed Stranger. Well, there's only one Red-Headed Stranger. So they didn't make a lot of money on those tapes, although it's actually a really good record. There's another record that they seized, which was the tapes from the session he did in Louisiana. And that is actually a really good record and got almost no attention. Sold very few copies. The Hungry Years, I think it was 152 records. I can't remember.
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, 152 records. It's crazy. That was, a very ambitious book. That's a lot of records. It's a lot of listening time.
Well, the thing that happened was I decided I was going to do the book this way is all the vinyl albums and CDs, box sets I have for Willie. And I actually already owned about 120 of those records. Oh. Went out and bought like another 10 of them, and the rest of them I sort of used Spotify.
Yeah.
I wrote this book very quickly, but that's only because I've written so much about Willie over the years that knew what I wanted to say, so it came fairly quickly.
His album, The Last Leaf on the Tree, released November of 24 with the title track written by Tom Waits. That song just kills me, especially with Willie's frail vocals and the fact that all of the highwaymen are gone except for him, and along with so many of his duet partners. The last album is Oh, What a Beautiful World, with all songs either written or co-written by Rodney Crowell and a duet with the two on the album. With 152 albums and another album coming out November 7th, I saw, called Working Man, Willie Sings More Earl, what do you think Willie Nelson's musical legacy will be?
Well, I think that he's obviously a giant of music, one of the great figures of the 20th century. I think that, to me, sort of what I mentioned earlier is that I think he is able to serve as an example to all of us of how to deal with loss and how to move on, how to not deny it, but not be crippled by it either. There's so many things. It made a lot of effort to acknowledge the long history of country music and all the people who came before him, Bob Wills, Farron Young, Hank Snow, Ernest Tubb, all these people, and to sort of remind his new listeners that there's a long line of people that he's followed. I think that my epilogue, I compare him to Ray Charles as one of these rare figures who used to be called songsters, who could play almost any genre of music because they had to. In the early part of the 20th century, you had to play show tunes and blues and gospel and country and jazz and whatever because, different audiences want different things and you need to make a living. Willie and Ray both sort of exemplify being able to master all those different genres and meld them into a very individual voice. They both have voices that are not pretty voices, but just are very individualistic voices, very dramatic voices, very impactful voices. Willie, he was definitely a country singer, first and foremost. Everything had this sort of country presentation that, if you were a country fan, you could recognize, oh yeah, this is something I'm familiar with. I like this. I get it. In the background of many songs, there were these other flavors. There was jazz, a really skilled jazz guitarist. There was blues. There was Tex-Mex. There was a little bit of rock and roll. These other flavors, you might notice them, you might not, but you could tell there's something about the song that's not like all the other songs. So he used the flavors that way as sort of background things that shifted the atmosphere of the song. And when he used that sort of weird jazz phrasing, Frank Sinatra, he told me, was his favorite singer. There's this delay that builds tension, and then there's a release. That's a very powerful device, especially when you're singing about people who are struggling with a crisis and then finding the way out. So that tension and release reinforces the lyrics. And for all those reasons, people don't realize what a great guitarist he is, what a great lyricist he is, what a great band leader he is. He made the harmonica a major country music instrument again. He did those Ray Price shuffles flawlessly. You could go on and on.
Well, it's a absolutely beautiful work of art, the time and attention to detail, yes, that you've put into the book. Willie Nelson, All the albums. For any Willie fan or just any fan of country music, it's a must-have. And Geoffrey, thank you so much for joining us today, and I really appreciate your time. It's a wonderful book about the music of Willie Nelson.
Thank you, Sarah, for having me on. It's been a great conversation.
I wanted to share with you something special, something I've been working on lately. It's called American Music Town. But follow the show so that you won't miss an episode. Here's a short clip. And your dad was, for 17 years, a staff engineer at Fame Studios. He also was a publisher at one point.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would say what he has done that's most notable is songwriting. I mean, he's written a bunch of big #1 hits. That happened when he was at Fame. I wish that I was a little more in-depth knowledgeable about the trajectory of everything that's happened in my dad's career, because occasionally he'll tell me stories of things I didn't know. Like, for example, the very first record that he ever played guitar on, which he's played a ton of guitar and session work on people's records too. The very first record he ever recorded on was a Wilson Pickett record. I didn't know that. And I'm like, imagine that being one of the first things that you ever did. What I do know is that the way that the whole thing kind of started was he started as an intern at Fame. He was one of the first people, UNA, to go through the music program there. So they developed a music program, which he later down the road ended up sitting on the board at that same program and teaching. So it kind of full circled. So he was one of the first people to go to school at UNA for music and interned at Fame and would stay there after hours. Everybody would think that the studio was locked up and he was leaving, and he would go in and he would record, and he would record himself. And one day Rick Hall, I guess, called him into his office, and my dad thought he was like really in trouble. And he said, "Did you stay here last night and record?" And he was like, yeah, I guess. And he said, this is incredible, and he said, this is absolutely incredible. So he started putting him on session work. He didn't know up until that point that he could play guitar, I guess. And that was what my dad did first. He is an incredible guitar player. That's how it started. There are some people that are just born with this ability to write songs in a way that I don't understand. I fully do not understand the way that my dad is able to just write songs the way that he does. So then he started writing songs and engineering on top of that. So he was kind of multifaceted in the way that his career unfolded. He was very smart and skilled in a lot of things. So he was able to sort of play on this record, then engineer that one, then write a song for it and engineer that record. And so there are a lot of records that he ended up producing and engineering that he had songs on. But then on top of that, when I was in middle school, probably, he started doing publishing. So he started in downtown Florence. He started a publishing company called Waltz Time Music. And that is where I remember like John Paul White from the Civil Wars. He signed him to his first publishing deal. He had Brad Chrysler, who went on to write a bunch of hits as well. And just a variety of people that were signed to his publishing. I remember those times very clearly.
Thank you so much for listening to AmericanaMusic.com podcast. Be sure to go to AmericanaMusic.com and find playlists of the Americana artists we've interviewed here. Also, be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform.